Paul Maisty completed a thesis under my direction in 1993, and we conducted a fairly extensive examination of the means for testing for independence amongst the various components of a DNA profile. His thesis was completed and it's been on the record since 1993. The first paper from the thesis appeared in print last week in the journal Genetica.
I'd like to turn your attention to what appears to be page 4 of your CV. And beginning on that page, are there publications listed of which you have either been sole author or co-author?
Well, starting on page 4 and then running some pages, it lists my complete publication list, yes.
And is that approximately 100 publications in total?
That's right.
Do they include a range of topics?
Well, yes and no. They're all involved in statistical analyses of genetic data. Some of them are purely theoretical. Some of them are applications of these methods to specific data sets, human, Drosophila, barley, maize. It doesn't really matter as far as my work is concerned what the organism is. Whenever genetic data are collected, then I'm happy to be involved in their analysis.
Have your publications included a substantial number dealing with human genetic characteristics?
Yes, in two different directions. What I'm primarily interested in is looking for associations of genetic markers with our human diseases. I think that's very important and very exciting work, and I've had several papers in that field. And as I said earlier, I've also been involved in the forensic arena recently, so I have had several papers targeted specifically to the kinds of data used by forensic scientists.
I'd like to call your attention, if I could, to two publications in particular. The first on page 5 that I believe is labeled number 29, titled Inferences About Linkage Disequilibrium.
Yes, that's a paper we published in 1979, talking about the methods to detect associations or lack of independence between elements at different genetic loci. It's one of my, I think, one of my more important papers. It's served as the foundation for a lot of our subsequent work.
All right, when you use the term independence among loci, can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean?
Well, it goes back to Mendel's second law, of course. What we are interested in knowing is if the information transmitted from parent to offspring at one locus, one region of the genome, is transmitted independently of information at different loci, different regions. For loci on different chromosomes, we would expect to find such independence, although, as I showed in my thesis in 1968, even loci on different chromosomes may have some slight dependence on the frequencies imposed by the size of the population and the mating structure. I'm digressing. The point is that we laid out in that paper some of the methods appropriate for detecting associations, regardless of the biological cause. And I think we need to stress that today. We are not interested in the biological mechanisms as much as in the consequences. What do the data look like? Do they exhibit independence, and therefore may we proceed to use product rules, or do they not show consistency with independence, in which case we need to do something else?
In other words, basically you're looking at whether or not different regions of DNA may be linked in some fashion.
Yeah, I would prefer to use the word associated. Linked has a technical term, and we're not talking about linkage, we're talking about associations.
Turning your attention, if I can, to page 9 of your CV, in particular a publication numbered 89 entitled Effects of Inbreeding on Forensic Calculations. Was that another paper that you personally authored?
Yes, it's one of my more recent, and we always think our most recent papers are our best, but this was an invited paper for the annual review of genetics. The invitation came some time ago, and then when it came time to actually put pen to paper, I chose to write on this current area of the forensic applications. The paper was invited, but it still was subject to peer review. And although it has a somewhat narrow focus, I really took the opportunity to summarize a great deal of my thinking in the appropriate ways of analyzing the data. And I think I should say here that this, I believe, lays out the appropriate way to account for population structuring and thereby diffuse some of the problems people have felt faced by these data.
Turning to the next page, page 10, there's also a category labeled Commentaries and Correspondence.
Yes.
That appears to have 13 different items in it. Can you just tell us in summary fashion what commentaries and correspondence are?
Well, I like to remove from my publication list those things which are not scientific papers in the sense they've been through a peer review process and present novel scientific information. Some of these are reviews. The 1992 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences was a review of the population genetic issues. I was invited by the editor of the journal to write a review, which I was pleased to do, but it did not go through a review process, a formal review. I solicited comments from several colleagues. So that is a review. Then there are several letters when I felt sufficiently annoyed with papers and journals that I would write a response, particularly to Science and Nature, who have published, once again, non-peer-reviewed, I don't want to say articles because they're not articles, they're pieces of writing. They have published items often critical of the forensic uses of DNA. I think they've given a very one-sided view of the debate. And on occasion I've managed to get a rebuttal letter published.
Now, when you refer to Science and Nature, you're referring to Science Magazine and Nature Magazine?
Yes, sir.
Turning to the next page, if we could, page 11, and in particular a category labeled Books. Have you published books in the area of population genetics and their relationship with statistical data?
Yes, in 1990 I published a book, Genetic Data Analysis, which is meant to be a very broad reference work, if you like, of all the methods likely to be encountered by people generating genetic data of the kind we'll be talking about, and some other kinds. In press currently there's a book to be published by Acclua entitled Human Identification. For that volume I acted as an editor. I solicited articles from a variety of people who have made substantial contributions to this field, and I was pleased when they agreed to write papers. The articles all went through a review process. The collection of papers has appeared already as a special issue of a journal, Genetica, and will appear as a hardcover book later this summer.
When you use the word Kluwer, is that K-L-U-W-E-R?
Yes, sir.
Turning, if we can, to what appears to be a second page 11, is that right?
Probably, yes. It does appear to be that way. It should be page 12. I'm sorry.
There's also a category entitled Book Reviews, is that right?
Yes, this is of really little consequence, I think. I publish reviews of other people's books.
In the same general areas you've described earlier?
Generally population, genetics, and statistics.
And then lastly, on what appear to be the remaining 2 pages, there is a listing of published abstracts by you.
Yes.
Just briefly, what are those?
These are just descriptions of presentations at some meetings.
All right, Your Honor, for purposes of this hearing, I'd asked that this particular exhibit, People's Exhibit 407, be admitted.
All right, it will be admitted.
Dr. Weir, I'd like to turn your attention to any activities you may have in terms of consulting in forensic DNA cases.
Yes.
First of all, do you engage in that type of activity?
Yes, I do.
What type of role do you have when you do that?
Well, on cases in particular, I'm approached by both defense and prosecution attorneys to give them assistance. I've always declined defense requests because I don't believe I can argue against the forensic uses of DNA. So when an attorney contacts me for the prosecution, I ask to see a copy of all reports provided them by the forensic scientists. And I focus on the statistical aspects of those reports. I then obtain the necessary databases used by that particular forensic scientist, conduct tests of such things as association, essentially duplicate the statistical aspects of the report, and then, if necessary, give testimony at both admissibility hearings and the subsequent trial.
Now, when you say you review the data, do you review the data in terms of not only the results of DNA testing in a forensic case, but also ultimately what are the frequencies reported to describe any matches?
Oh yes, that's part of my analysis. So.
And as far as looking at that type of data and your analysis, what are you looking for?
I'm looking for confirmation of my prior beliefs that the DNA markers used in forensic science are associated freely, that there is no evidence for dependence within or between loci.
And does that again relate to the ultimate use in a given case?
Yes, I'm sorry. Once we have demonstrated consistency with independence, then we may proceed to use the product rule. As I think I said earlier, if I find evidence for dependence, then we have to modify the production of profile frequencies.
And when you use the term dependence, would that then be the same as referring to association if you find it?
That's right, yes.
Approximately how many times have you consulted in this manner you've described?
I think I've given testimony in 16 cases.
And is that in one state or more than one state of this country?
It's the east and west coasts, California, Oregon, Washington on the west coast.
And in those instances, have you been allowed to testify as an expert in this area of genetic data and population frequencies?
Yes.
Now, as far as your own experience, and if you could describe to the court, please, how is it that in terms of these DNA typing techniques and genetic marker results that are obtained using them, that you became involved and experienced in examining the data obtained as a result of these testings? Is that question clear?
It wasn't particularly clear.
I didn't think so. What I'm really asking you, Dr. Weir, is as far as these DNA typing techniques and then ultimately obtaining results from them, how did you gain your experience to be able to look at these results and then determine from these tests whether or not there is, for instance, any of this association?
Well, my experience really points to my entire career. Since my early publications, I have been involved in setting up methods, not all of them, of course, directly relevant, but we talked about a 1979 paper. At that time, we were setting up statistical methods to analyze genetic data. This was, remember, a long time before DNA markers were in vogue. The methods we developed at that point have come to be seen as appropriate for the data we're currently involved with. So I think I'm qualified and have been requested to work on these issues on the basis of my publications, which, as I said, date back a long way.
And they deal with, for example, RFLP typing results and data generated as a result of that?
Oh, certainly.
As well as PCR type results?
Absolutely.
Have you in fact developed methods, that is, personally developed methods to evaluate this type of information?
Well, I can't publish a paper unless I have something new, so my papers, I think, invariably describe new tests or new approaches to old tests or evaluations of tests. So I think it's fair to say that the methods I use are either so standard they don't need to be justified, or that they're ones that we have worked on and provided the justification.
You described around, I believe it was 1983, during your sabbatical, and I think that was the Guggenheim Fellowship period?
Yes, sir.
That obviously, or first of all, let me ask it as a question, was that around the time that DNA typing techniques were being developed?
As it turns out, probably while I was sitting in Edinburgh, Professor Jeffries was down the road at Leicester working on the methods which have subsequently came to be called DNA fingerprints.
As far as these methods that you utilized or have developed to evaluate genetic marker data, did you develop some of those methods even before DNA typing was available?
Yes, certainly.
And have you developed additional methods since DNA typing has been available?
Yes, one of the interesting aspects of the forensic uses, apart from the obvious applications, the interest to me is that the data are so discriminating. The RFLPs in particular have so many types, which is the reason they're used, that they prevented some novel challenges for such issues as testing for independence. So we had to do a little development and extension of our previous works. And then, of course, our methods must be tailored to the way the data are generated. I'm sure you've heard described Cellmark's floating bin method versus the FBI's fixed bin methods. These are different ways of generating data. Those different ways must be reflected in the methods of analysis. So I've had to accommodate those methods in the subsequent analyses.
That was actually going to be the next question I asked, and perhaps I can ask it in a somewhat summary fashion. In your evaluation of DNA typing data, do you use methods that were developed either by yourself or others even before DNA typing was available?
Yes, I think I've said that, yes.
And do you also then use methods developed either by yourself or others to evaluate DNA typing data that were developed after DNA typing was available?
Certainly, yes. I think it's necessary to perform appropriate statistical validation studies on the forensic databases.
So is it correct? I'm sorry.
Before they're used.
Is it correct to say then that many of these techniques that are even used today to evaluate DNA data have been in existence for many, many years?
Oh, certainly.
Now I'd like to turn your attention, Dr. Weir, to experience that you've previously had with Cellmark Diagnostics.
All right.
Is there any relationship between your university and Cellmark?
Yes, we have a contractual arrangement. I think it's technically called a memorandum of understanding, whereby my university undertakes to perform analyses for Cellmark.
What work do you, well, first of all, are you involved in that relationship?
Yes.
What type of work does that entail?
Currently, and the immediate reason for the contract was to evaluate their new databases. As you probably know, they have data collected from their paternity testing business, and they have culled data from their paternity records to serve as a forensic database. And Cellmark wished these new databases to be evaluated for independence.
And you have been involved in that evaluation?
Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with the methods used in Cellmark or at Cellmark Diagnostics as far as reporting population frequency data based on DNA matches?
Yes, I am.
When did you first become familiar with the methods that they utilize?
I think it must have been late 1990. I had discussions with them, and they provided me with copies of their then current databases and were very generous in both sharing the data and explaining in some detail how the data were collected, how they were used, explained their binning strategies and so forth. And with their cooperation, I was able to perform analyses and subsequently publish those. I think it was 1991 in a paper in the American Journal of Human Genetics.
In fact, in your CV, do you list a specific reference? And perhaps we can, if you're able to point us in the direction of what publication number that publication is in which you published your own results of evaluating data at Cellmark.
That's item number 77. I say it was published in 1992.
Listed on page 8 of your CV?
Yes, sir.
And I'm sorry, that was number 77?
Number 77.
As far as your familiarity with frequency calculations and frequency data at Cellmark, does that include RFLP data?
Yes, this paper we're talking about here was RFLP. As part of our contract, we've also examined their current PCR database.
Would that include the genetic marker DQ alpha?
DQ alpha polymarker, yes.
And when you use the term polymarker, are you referring to 5 individual genetic markers that are collectively referred to as polymarker or PM?
That's right.
I'd like to turn your attention, Dr. Weir, to the California Department of Justice.
All right.
To your knowledge, well, first of all, are you aware of what types of data are used at the California Department of Justice in the area of frequency data?
Yes, over the last few months I've had several conversations with Gary Sims, who's explained to me that the DOJ uses data collected by the FBI.
Could you describe for the court, please, how and if you are familiar with FBI data in the area of DNA typing?
Yes, I first met Dr. Podolny from the FBI, I think in December of 1989, and he asked for some assistance and collaboration on interpreting and analyzing their databases, and subsequently provided me with their current and subsequent versions of their various databases. And as a result of that initial contact, I did some work on their RFLPs and published an analysis of that also in 1992, item number 72, a paper published in the journal Genetics. Since that time, I've kept close contact with the FBI. We have no financial or contractual arrangements at all with the FBI. I've kept close contact with them, and as they've added more probes, I've kept up, if you like, with their analysis. And the most recent data I obtained from them was in this year, RFLP, and I've also got a copy of a set of their PCR-based loci and performed analyses on those.
So you are familiar with the FBI's databases as used by the Department of Justice in this case, both in the RFLP markers as well as the PCR markers used at the Department of Justice?
Yes, I am.
To your knowledge, does that include DQ alpha and D1S80? And I'm referring to the Department of Justice.
Yes, there's a constellation of 7 loci, DQ alpha, D1S80, and the 5 collectively known as the polymarker.
The publication you described, that publication involved your analysis of FBI data, is that right? In particular, RFLP frequencies.
There's item number 72, and then a more recent paper, the one number 96, also on RFLP data from the FBI.
And that was published in the journal Genetics?
Genetica.
As far as your own personal analysis of data, has that been limited to Cellmark and the FBI, or has it included other forensic laboratories?
No, I've been kept quite busy. In the private sector, I've looked at data from Life Codes, Genetic Design, and a Roche Biomedical. In the government agencies, apart from the FBI, the State Bureau of Investigation in North Carolina, and the corresponding agencies in South Carolina, Dade County and Broward County in Florida, Minnesota, Oregon, Toronto, New Zealand, Australia, and the United Kingdom.
Now, in these analyses that you undertake with regard to these labs, can you briefly tell us what that entails? What are you looking for?
Well, we are looking primarily for any evidence of associations between the various types. And we are also looking for measures of the degree to which different populations differ, the amount of difference in frequencies between, say, Caucasians and Hispanics.
Have you, first of all, with reference to this particular case before the court involving Mr. Simpson, have you undertaken a review of frequency data generated by both Cellmark and the California Department of Justice?
Yes.
And in the course of that review, have you produced a report?
I have a somewhat fluid report, yes.
By fluid, what do you mean?
I mean it has been undergoing improvements.
Your Honor, at this time, I'd ask to have marked as, perhaps the best method would be Exhibit 408
All right.
and 408A, and I'll describe them.
Exhibit 408 appears to be a report by Dr. Weir dated June 21, 1995, consisting of what appear to be one cover sheet plus pages 1 through 48. And I'd ask that 408A be a similar report dated also June 21st, but with the additional notation addendum, which appears to consist of 4 pages plus a cover sheet,
Thank you.
which have been provided to the defense at more than one time period.
different forms.
Doctor, we're showing you first what will be Exhibit 408, the lengthier document. Is that the report that you have prepared in this case?
Yes, it is.
Referring specifically, well, let me go a little further with Exhibit 408. First of all, that has some stamped numbers in the upper right-hand corner. Is that right?
DNA, is it 09477?
You're not involved in the placement of those numbers. Is that right?
No, those numbers are not mine.
With regard to this particular document, and it is dated yesterday, is that right, June 21st?
Yes.
Did you, since yesterday, produce what can be perhaps characterized as 2 replacement pages with some changes in data on 2 of the pages?
Yes, I did, and I should apologize, although I don't think I am completely to blame. In doing doing RFLP calculations for the DOJ report, I had included all the bands they reported in their profiles, forgetting or not knowing that they do not report frequencies on the high molecular weight bands. So that, I apologize for that. I removed those bands yesterday and so essentially replaced those 2 pages.
That led to a correction of those 2 pages? In other words, the information you obtained yesterday?
Yes.
Could you just tell us what your page numbers are for those 2 pages so that the record will be clear?
It's pages 21, page 22, and the corrections are on table 18. And I see this copy is annotated, replaces. And then on page, I believe it's page 42.
Or 41?
Excuse me, page 41, table 32. These are both tables referring to the DOJ's RFLP calculations, now reflecting the fact that the high molecular weight bands do not have frequencies assigned to them.
Incidentally, do those corrections in these 2 replacement pages have anything to do with DNA mixtures in this case?
Oh, no.
Now, if I can turn your attention to the shorter document, 408A, can you simply tell us briefly what that document is?
Yes, my full report contains information on mixtures, except for the RFLP mixtures on the glove reported by DOJ. I received that information later, so this addendum is simply to present really a table of frequencies for the 3 items from the glove on which there were RFLP mixtures.
So the addendum 408A refers to RFLP glove mixtures, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Now,
from DOJ.
From the Department of Justice.
Yes.
As far as this case, can you describe for us the material that you reviewed to conduct your analysis?
Well, I've reviewed the various reports provided by both Cellmark and DOJ. And of course, as always in any such case, I review the appropriate databases from either the FBI or from Cellmark. Maybe this is the appropriate place to say that all my calculations rely on 3 sets of data. The Cellmark RFLP databases, both their original and their new, that's 1 set. The FBI's RFLP data on 7 RFLP loci, and then the FBI's PCR database, the whole 7 PCR loci.
As far as this review, you utilized material provided to you by both laboratories?
Yes, both their reports, which I obtained through the prosecution, and numerous telephone conversations.
That was actually going to be my next question. Did there come instances, or did there arise instances in which you had questions that you needed answers from the testing laboratories?
Yes, and in particular on the mixtures, I needed to be absolutely sure what the labs had found in their mixture studies, and I believe I now understand that, and that greatly simplified the analysis to have a complete understanding.
Did there come a time when you were asked to examine mixtures in this case as far as frequency data was concerned?
Well, I'm not sure. As soon as I obtained the reports, I proceeded to an analysis, and then I think Ms. Khan asked me, or maybe it was you who asked me a little while ago to do a complete analysis.
Perhaps we can provide a little bit of a history. Did you produce an initial report earlier this year?
Well, yes, in December I wrote a report and began on the analysis of mixtures and didn't proceed very far at that point, merely to point out that there were mixtures available, these needed to be interpreted. But I don't believe I did any calculations at that point.
Did you perform calculations on the non-mixtures?
Oh yes, on all the single stains that were available to me then.
And I believe you said that was as early as December?
Yes, I wrote the report and sent it late December.
Now, carrying forward to later in 1995, were you at some point asked to look at mixtures in terms of calculating frequencies?
Yes.
And you simply don't recall if that was Ms. Khan or myself?
No, I don't.
Can I just a moment, Your Honor? Dr. Weir, as far as mixtures, what I'm going to ask you to do is describe for the court, please, about the area of attaching frequencies to mixtures. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I'd like to do it slowly
That's a good idea.
and to set the language to talk about single stains first, because it's not different. When there is a single stain found to match a person of interest, to attach some numerical weight to that evidence of a match, the first step is to calculate the frequency with which random people would produce the profile found in the stain. So we loosely say we calculate the frequency of the evidentiary profile. In essence, we add up all the possible people who could have contributed. Now, the addition's kind of trivial because there's only one type there. There's a single genotype, and we add up that single genotype frequency. And that number is what we've seen reported in this case. Typically, these are given as 1 in some number, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 1,000,000. Remember that those are frequencies. Frequencies of the stain. It's best to interpret that number by flipping it upside down and saying the evidence is 1,000 times more likely to have arisen if it was given by this person versus if it was given by an unknown person. It's the unknown person for whom we've calculated the frequency. Now let's turn to a mixture, and if we look at all the typing, and there are more than 2 alleles at any locus.
And you're referring now to whether it's RFLP or PCR markers?
That's correct. Any of the loci examined, if they have more than 2 alleles, we have evidence that there was more than one contributor to the stain. If we look at all the loci and find 2, 3, or 4 alleles at every locus, we have evidence that there were 2 contributors. If we found more than 4 alleles at any locus, we would have evidence of at least 3 contributors, and so forth. To keep things in focus here, let's suppose that the evidence at all the loci typed has 4 or fewer alleles. The evidence points to there have been 2 contributors. We want to attach a frequency. The question, remember, and it's not possible to avoid the proper framework. The framework is, how do we interpret the evidence? We believe either that the evidence, the stain was contributed by these 2 particular people or 3 particular people, or it was not. The or it was not can be interpreted as this stain was contributed by 2 unknown people, or by 3 unknown people. What is the frequency with which 2 unknown people would contribute this stain? So we add up all the frequencies of 2 people, pairs of people, who between them would have this mixed stain. So if there was a single locus and there were 4 bands, 4 alleles, 1, 2, 3, and 4, we have to add up all the possibilities. How likely is it that 2 people, 2 unknown people, between them would have these 4 bands? The people might be, the first person might have bands 1 and 2, the second person have bands 3 and 4. Or it might be that the first person has bands 1 and 3, second person 2 and 4. There are a whole host of situations. It's essential to interpret the data correctly. The evidence suggests there is a mixture. To perform an analysis which ignores the evidence of there being a mixture is wrong. It is completely misleading. We must add up the frequencies under the situation suggested by the evidence. The evidence suggests 2 contributors. We must add up the frequencies with which 2 contributors between them have this mixed profile.
All right. Could I have just a moment again, Your Honor?
Yes. I was going to turn to use of the ELMO so that the witness could demonstrate something. However, we apparently need, if we could have a brief recess to be able to do that.
How brief?
10 minutes, I'm told.
What do we need to have?
Just the overhead projector, the ELMO system turned on, because the document's not complicated. I mean, using the document's not complicated. I think it's just...
Why don't you just hand me the document?
All right, if that's fine. I have given a copy to counsel.
All right.
Actually, let me start with using one of the boards, if I may, Your Honor.
All right.
Dr. Weir, what I'm going to ask you to look at is a particular result in this case. First of all, with regard
Mr. Park, why
to...
don't you go ahead and spin that around so both the doctor and I can see it, since we don't have to worry about whether the jury can see it. Thank you.
First of all, Dr. Weir, have you seen a smaller or 8.5 by 11 version of this particular board?
Yes, sir.
What I'm going to ask you to do, and first of all, in your analysis of the results in this case, did you look at what's labeled on this board as item number 29, steering wheel?
Yes.
Would that be an example that you could use, that is the actual results with regard to that item, to talk about frequencies in mixtures?
That would be fine.
That particular item contained results, and let's look, if we can, at simply the DQ alpha marker. Is that acceptable?
That's fine.
The particular results on item number 29 at the DQ alpha marker showed the appearance of 3 different alleles. Is that right?
That's right. And just reading from the board here, 1.1, 1.2, and 4. And I should say now that I am taking no notice of descriptors such as weaker or possible trace. I am assuming that if the allele is mentioned, it's present.
So when you perform your own analyses, when a particular allele is described as present, you're not paying attention for frequency purposes of a description such as weaker, trace, etc.
That's right.
Now, with regard to that particular item at the DQ alpha marker, does that indicate a mixture?
Yes, there are 3 alleles, and that must, obviously, it implies more than one contributor. One person would only have 2 alleles.
As far as your review of this particular case and the specific results, and in particular with regard to that item, were you asked to calculate an approximate frequency to describe that mixture and how often one might encounter that mixture?
Yes, I was and did calculate the frequency with which two contributors or three contributors would have between them those three alleles.
All right. Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to have marked then as Exhibit 409 a one-page document that's labeled at the top, percentage of population included in LAPD number 29.
All right.
I'm told that if the monitors are turned on that we can proceed, Your Honor.
All right, Dr. Weir, I think there's an on button on your monitor there. I don't know if
It
it's...
seems to be on.
Yes, it is.
Thank you.
As a foundation, with what will be marked Exhibit 409, the one-page document, have you had an opportunity to look at that document? You probably
Yes.
are asking yourself, what document is it? Did you have a chance,
Yes, you have showed me this page, yes.
and does that page relate to item number 29 and the particular alleles that were revealed by testing by both Cellmark and the Department of Justice?
Yes, it just lays out, without the all the details, it lays out the method I used to calculate the frequency of two contributors to a mixture.
Very good. Actually, let me also hand a copy. First of all, Dr. Weir, there have been copies made showing you this one-page document that will be Exhibit 409. Is that the document that you
Yes.
had an opportunity to look at?
Yes, sir.
And we have an extra copy for the court also, if you could hand yours.
Excuse me.
Now, Dr. Weir, could you describe what this particular document shows?
Yes, this is, just as I said, it's to lay out the possibilities with which two people would contribute to the DQ alpha mixed stain. As we've said, the mixed stain has three alleles, and we know therefore it's a mixture. There is, I should say, there is no evidence at any of the loci typed on item 29 of there being three contributors. However, for this demonstration, we have we're working under the assumption there were two contributors, and I must stress we must work under the assumption of it being a mixture. By definition, there is more than one contributor. So we need to examine the possibilities. How likely is it that two people would have between them these three alleles? So you have listed out, looks like a dozen or so possibilities. The first person, for example, the first row here, the first person could be a 1.1 homozygote, the second person a 1.2 and 4 heterozygote.
In other words, let me stop you for a moment. That is one possibility when there are two contributors to a mixture to produce the results that were obtained by these laboratories.
That's right. If those two people were the contributors to the stain would look like as it does. The stain would have those three alleles, no more and no less, if those two people were the contributors.
Now, is the remainder of that left-hand column, or the two left-hand columns, first person and second person, simply the remaining possibilities for a two-person mixture producing those results?
Yes, I think there are all the possibilities, all the ways in which two people between them could have those three alleles.
Is the second line a misprint? First person 1.2?
It should be a 1.24, yes, Your Honor.
I'm afraid I'll have to take responsibility for that one, Your Honor. Incidentally, this document, it was not prepared by you. Is that right, Dr. Weir?
That's correct.
So should that one point under the second listing of first person simply be deleted so that it would read 1.2, comma 4?
Yes.
Now, in the upper portion, and this is referring simply to the first listing of first person 1.1, 1.1, and second person 1.2, and then 4, there are listed two categories of racial groups, is that right?
That's right. Excuse me.
Is this simply one listing of what, if the chart were complete, would be many more listings?
That's right. In all our calculations, single or mixed stains, when we compute frequencies for unknown people, we must recognize that these are really unknown. We know nothing about their ethnicity. We don't know which frequencies to attach, so we go through all the possibilities we have. For example, these two people, the first one may have been African American and the second Caucasian, or vice versa. Or one of them, the first one may have been African American, the second Hispanic, or vice versa. And we could go on, and what I have done in this case is to assume that either of the two people were not of 4 different ethnicities, but have frequencies I've taken from 4 different databases.
Incidentally, this chart, as is shown now on the overhead projector, is it taken simply from your report?
This is essentially an extraction of Table 29B.
And in your report, have you described all of these combinations under the first person and second person, as well as all of the major racial category combinations for both a 2-person and a 3-person mixture?
I have.
Can you describe for the court, please, and I'm referring now to, again, simply the first possible combination listed at the top, how a calculation is made by you or was made by you with regard to this mixture?
Yes. Well, I'm invoking the product rule. I'm calculating the frequency of a combination of alleles by multiplying together their separate frequencies.
So if you could just describe for us what those numbers, what are they describing that are listed under the 2 racial categories and then ultimately the frequency at the end?
All right. So the first line of the table is where the first person was a 1.1 homozygote, this unknown person, and this unknown person has frequencies which could be described by the African American database. Now, I've reported those frequencies in my report, but I'll just tell you the frequency in the FBI's PCR database for allele 1.1 in the African Americans is 0.117. So we square that frequency. It multiply it by itself because we have 2 copies of that allele for that unknown homozygous person.
Let me stop you for a moment. When you square it or multiply it by itself, is that the same process that's used for describing stains from one donor in this case?
Certainly.
And that's used across the various boards, is it?
Yes.
That you've been provided copies of?
Yes.
In other words, those are frequencies that have already, to your knowledge, been reported in court in this case.
Those are the single person frequencies, yes.
All right, proceed if you would.
So that we've accounted, now we've attached a number to the chance of the first person being of 1.1 homozygous genotype and have frequency from African American. The second person we have assumed for this calculation to be Caucasian. We don't know, we've assumed it for this calculation here. That person is a 1.24 heterozygote, so we multiply together the frequencies of the 1.2 allele, that number is 0.176, and the 4 allele, that number is 0.328, and of course we have to double that product from the, we don't know which way round the alleles came to the person, what their parental origins. So we now have a frequency if this is the 2PQ frequency for that genotype from the Caucasian database.
And again, is that the same step, that is, of multiplying the frequencies of the 2 different alleles and then multiplying it by 2 that's used in the reporting of single stain DNA results?
Yes, it certainly is. Now, of course, the only novel feature of this analysis is to recognize there were 2 contributors, and these people we are assuming are independent, and we multiply their frequencies together. So, and that's the right-hand column, the 0.00158, which is about 0.15%. That's the frequency with which 2 people at random have those 2 specific genotypes, one person being African American, the other being Caucasian.
Now, do you then undertake that same analysis with regard to, and let's just stay with for the moment, the first possible combination of 1.1, 1.1, and 1.24? Do you calculate that for each of the racial combinations that are possible?
Yes. As I said, I'm using the FBI's 4 databases, so there are a total of 10 possible pairs of databases.
Do you also then, and did you in terms of your analysis in this case, perform the same calculation for the remaining 11 combinations of DQ alpha types amongst 2 people?
That's right.
And do you, for each one of those, produce ultimately a frequency for each combination that would, on this chart, if it were totally complete, then go under the category or column of frequency?
That's right.
Once you've done that for each possible combination, what do you do next?
Add up those, sum those frequencies, sum the frequencies of the unknown contributors.
In other words, sum, in this instance, what would be 0.15%, sum the next calculation for the second combination of markers, and on down to the bottom with all 12.
That's right. We sum the frequencies of all the possible genotypes for the pairs of people that could have contributed, yes.
And in terms of your analysis in this case, as well as your report, did you report those totals for each racial category combination?
Almost. We are almost there. This is for the DQ alpha.
Yes.
We then need to repeat the calculations for the other loci and the mixture. In this case, well, I guess it's only DQ alpha here, so excuse me. So then we are complete. The sum of those 12 numbers, as I've reported here, is 1 in 71.
And that would be for what racial category?
That's when either of the contributors was African American and the other was Caucasian.
Incidentally, with regard to item 29, and let's clarify that, assuming that there were indeed, well, first of all, were you informed and provided material that there were also polymarker results on the steering wheel?
Yes, and I realize I've just misled you. The 1 in 71 is in fact the number from using all the loci. So that would be the cell mark determination, DQ alpha plus polymarker. I've used all the 6 loci, done a calculation like we see on this chart, multiply those results from each locus together, multiply the sums for each locus.
Now, when you've used the example of 1 out of 71, that was just one of the combinations possible, that is, 1 African American and 1 Caucasian, correct?
That's right.
And you also performed this summing technique for each of the combinations of African American, Caucasian, Southwest Hispanic, and Southeast Hispanic?
Yes, the whole 10 combinations.
And you, in fact, produced tables showing what the frequencies would be using this calculation method for each of these combinations.
I did.
This method that you've described, in your opinion, is that an appropriate one to describe a frequency?
It is both my opinion and it's the recommendation from the literature.
And the recommendation of the literature.
Yes.
When you say the literature, what are you referring to?
I'm referring to a paper by Everett et al. In 1989, I think. Excuse me. Everett et al. 1991, Journal of the Forensic Science Society, Volume 31, page 41.
Spell that name for us, please.
Everett, E-V-E-T-T.
What is there about this? Well, let me rephrase that question. Did you conduct this same analysis in this same method with regard to the remaining mixtures in this case?
Yes, I did.
Does this method apply to RFLP results as well as DQ alpha results?
Certainly.
I'm sorry. Does it apply to not only RFLP results but also PCR results as well?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time I'd ask to be marked as Exhibit 410.
410.
A document previously provided to the prosecution by the defense some weeks ago, entitled Percentage of Population Included in Stain Number 29 Bronco Steering Wheel, that has a different appearance than the previous chart.
All right.
And perhaps if we could, with the court's permission, use the projector again. Dr. Weir, do you see the document that will be marked shortly, Exhibit 410?
Yes,
Have you seen that document previously?
yes.
Does this document refer to the same results, and I'm referring to just the DQ alpha results, on the same evidence item, number 29, the steering wheel stain?
Yes, it does.
Is this, well, first of all, is this a table of some sort?
Yes.
What does it describe?
It describes, it adds up, it describes the single person genotypes who could have been contributors to the stain. Let me restate that. It lays out all the genotypes of individual people who could be amongst the contributors to the mixed stain.
How does this compare, and I'm only referring to the listing of possible genotypes, what differences, if any, are there between this chart and your own?
Well, they're the same. For an individual, that chart and yours both list all the possible genotypes.
There were 12 combinations listed on your chart, and there appear to be simply 6 listings under the term matching genotypes on this second chart, Exhibit 410. Is that right?
That's correct.
What's the difference between the two?
Well, the one we are looking at on display now is for single people. It has no relevance, of course, because we know this is a mixture. This is a mixture of at least 2 people. So to add up the frequencies of single individuals, I would say, at best is misleading.
Well, let's go into a little bit more detail about this chart. What does it list off to the right of the column matching genotypes?
Well, for each of the single genotypes, the frequencies are listed from 3 databases, and those frequencies, I'm sure, are correct. So 1.9% of Caucasians are expected to be 1.1 DQ alpha homozygotes. And it's interesting, 1.9%, I imagine I should say we have slightly different databases, but that 1.9 corresponds to our previous 0.117 squared. It's the same, purports to be the same frequency. The numbers are different because they're different databases.
Okay, let me stop you for just a moment. As far as a description of differences in approaches to mixtures, the fact that the databases in this specific example are different, does that impact your ability to describe the different approaches to frequency calculations?
No, it has no impact.
Now, as far as these frequencies then on this chart, Exhibit 410, do they reflect then simply frequencies in these 3 racial groups, major racial groups, of these different 6 genotypes?
That's right.
You've used the term "this is misleading," referring to this chart. Is that right?
Absolutely is, yes.
And you're referring to it being misleading in the context of the results for item 29 in this case. Is that right?
Yes, I believe it's quite misleading.
Why is it quite misleading?
Because it gives the impression that this mixed genotype would occur. It gives the impression, it doesn't say so, but it gives the impression this mixed stain would occur in 45.4% of Caucasians. Now, I know that's not what that chart says, but that's the distinct impression it's giving. The impression is given that this mixed stain would be found almost half the time if the unknown contributor was Caucasian. That's nonsense.
Why?
Because we have a mixture of 3 alleles from 2 people or more. It makes no sense at all to say that that mixture could occur nearly 50% of the time.
With regard, I'm sorry.
When I've just demonstrated that the frequency with which 2 people would give rise to that mixture is 1 in 71, and we can go on to describe the frequency with which 3 people. We cannot and should not present any analyses on mixtures which ignore the fact that it is a mixture.
In your opinion, does this chart, simply summing up the genotypes, ignore the fact that the stain is a mixture?
It does.
In your own calculations, and I believe you've already stated, you did it for both 2 possible contributors as well as 3 possible contributors. Is that right?
I did.
Does this calculation process, as shown as, again, in the document Exhibit 410 that's on the projector, does it differentiate in any manner between 2 contributors, 3 contributors, or however many?
And this document makes no such distinction. It is only for a single contributor, in fact.
In your opinion, is the method utilized by you in this case a more accurate and reliable means of assigning a frequency to a mixture?
I would take out the word more. It is reliable and accurate.
In your view, is the method as demonstrated by this exhibit 410, can you say the same about it?
It is not appropriate.
Now, for purposes of this hearing only, Your Honor, I'm going to ask the witness to refer to a passage that we have previously discussed in the National Research Council report.
Funny, I was about to do that myself.
And I think I have a Xerox copy of that page, if that's acceptable. I don't know if the court wants it marked as an exhibit or not.
Oh, we can refer to it as page 59 of the NRC report if that's what you're about to do.
Yes, exactly.
All right.
Showing you, Dr. Ware, a one-page Xerox. First of all, have you had an opportunity before today to read a document entitled DNA Technology and Forensic Science from the National Research Council?
Yes, I have read it.
Have you, in fact, read it in some detail on prior occasions?
Yes.
The document before you, is that simply a one-page Xerox, although I believe it has some highlighting on it in yellow, of, in particular, page 59 of that report?
Yes, it is.
That report contains a reference to samples that are mixtures, is that right?
Yes.
And in particular, with respect to that reference, the final sentence in what appears to be the fourth full paragraph contains a statement about an appropriate manner, according to this report, of dealing with mixtures. Is that right?
That's right.
Could you just read that sentence?
If a suspect's pattern is found within the mixed pattern, the appropriate frequency to assign such a match is the sum of the frequencies of all genotypes that are contained within, i.e. that are a subset of the mixed pattern.
With regard to that statement, what does that mean to you as an expert?
Well, I have trouble answering that question, as I would have answering any question on this NRC report. However, because I have little regard for the report statistics, the report is saying that we should add up the frequencies of all genotypes that are contained. The sentence as it's contained is ambiguous. It would allow a person to interpret as adding up the genotypes for single people, as we see on the chart on the board, or to add up the frequencies of genotypes, meaning genotypes of the plural contributors, which is what I've done.
Okay, let me stop you for just a moment. From your reading of that one-sentence description or recommendation, is it your opinion that it is written in such a fashion that you can't determine from its words whether it's describing the technique that you have used in this case or any other technique?
I believe it's ambiguous, yes.
In your view, does it cover the technique as shown by Exhibit 410, which is simply adding up genotypes?
Yes.
In your opinion, does it also include the technique utilized by you and previously described this morning in this case?
I think it does, but I don't think that's relevant to my calculations.
In what sense?
As I'm not going to base any of my calculations on this NRC report.
As far as multiple contributors, and I may have asked this before, you've done it for 2 or 3 possible contributors in this case.
That's right. As I said, the evidence contains information of more than one contributor. It contains no information whatever of more than 2 contributors. I know that there would be interest in there being 3 contributors to some of the stains. The evidence points to 2 contributors. I've chosen to do calculations as if there were 3 contributors in addition.
Your technique allows you the ability to do that for more than 2, 3, 4, etc.
Certainly, the calculations get more lengthy, but no more complicated.
Your Your Honor, I would like to move in these three remaining, actually, I think it's four remaining exhibits, again, for purposes of this hearing only. And I think that would be 408 as well as 408A, 409, and 410.
All right, they'll be received.
And I have no further questions.
All right. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll start with the cross-examination. All right, Doctor, you can step down.
10 placed on the Elmo, please. Okay. Dr. Weir, I'd like you to take a look at this chart that's previously been marked, chart 410, that was prepared by the defense. And I think you'll see on this chart there's a list of numbers that are summed.
Yes.
Can you tell me, is each of those numbers the frequency of a genotype?
Yes, I believe so.
All right. Now let's take a look at chart number 409, please. Now, Dr. Weir, are you looking at chart 409, which was previously prepared by the prosecution?
Yes, I am.
All right. Now, I'd like you to look at this, the number that's listed under the column headed frequency, this number 0.15%.
Yes.
Dr. Weir, is that the frequency of a genotype?
It's the frequency of genotypes of the contributors to the mixed stain.
But it's not the frequency of a genotype.
No,
is it?
certainly not. That would be quite inappropriate.
And what it actually is the product of the frequencies of two genotypes.
Certainly, certainly.
And so the reason that that number is so small, at 0.15%, is that you've taken two numbers and multiplied them together, taking two percentages and multiplied them together to get a smaller percentage. Isn't that what you've
The
done?
frequency is the product, yes.
All right. Now, does the National Research Council report say anything about taking the product of two frequencies before you sum up these?
No, but that's implied by the language. The frequency of the genotypes couldn't mean anything else.
All right. So your conclusion is that it couldn't mean anything else. That's the way you read it.
Certainly, we're talking about a mixture. To talk about an analysis of a mixture, ignoring the mixture would make no sense, and I don't believe that that was what was intended.
Is that what you always believed the NRC report meant, or is this a new interpretation you've arrived at only recently?
I hadn't ever thought about this until quite recently. I've always done the correct way.
Well, what perplexes me, Dr. Weir, is that you've prepared several different versions of a report in this
Yes,
case, have you
I have,
not?
yes.
The objection argument is for the question.
Overruled. Proceed.
All right. We have one report from you that's co-authored with Mr. Buckleton,
Dr. Buckleton.
Dr.
Yes.
Buckleton, that is dated May 11th.
Yes.
That's correct. And in the report with Dr. Buckleton, you used likelihood ratios, a different kind of statistic.
No, not a different kind of statistic.
All right, let me rephrase the question. You used likelihood ratios to provide a measure of the extent to which the evidence favors one scenario over another. Is that
The
correct?
complete analysis must be in that framework. Of course, a part of that calculation is the part we're discussing at this point. This is the first part in the complete and appropriate analysis.
All right, and then on May 31st, you produced another report labeled a draft. This one single-authored by yourself, is that right?
If you say yes. Mhm.
All right, and this report also used likelihood ratios to characterize the value of mixtures.
Oh, as does my current report. The phrasing is still there, but my current report is focusing on this component of the likelihood ratio.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, the report says likelihood ratios are essential in interpreting the evidentiary value of mixed stains, doesn't it?
Yes, that's true, yes, whether they're single or mixed. And of course, we have had them throughout this case. Every number that's on the board is in fact giving us a likelihood ratio. The numbers I've discussed this morning for the mixture stains are giving us likelihood ratios by inverting them.
Likelihood ratio for distinguishing between what hypotheses, Dr. Weir?
The hypothesis of the two contributors being known versus them both being unknown.
Okay. Are you planning to tell the jury that those frequency numbers are in fact likelihood ratios?
If I'm asked and under oath, I would have no choice but to say, of course they are.
Okay. Then there was another report that was produced just this week with the date of June 20th. You're familiar with that? That was, June 20th is actually Tuesday.
Yes.
All right. Let's see where that one is. Yeah, the June 20th. Oh, I got it. Yeah. So there's a June 20th report. On Tuesday we got a report. That report also used likelihood ratios. Is that right?
Well, all the reports have likelihood ratio language in them. All the reports also calculate frequencies of multiple contributors to a mixed stain. I'm not sure I understand what the distinction you're trying to make.
Okay. And in the report of June 20th, you are quite critical of the National Research Council's method for dealing with mixtures, are you not?
If it was interpreted as a single mixed, yes, a single contributor, I would be, yes.
Right. In fact, I see the sentence that reads, in particular, the method of assigning frequencies for mixtures suggested by the NRC report ignores the type of the profile of the person or people of interest and therefore has no probative value. Is that, do you remember that sentence being in the
Yes, but
report?
that's a separate issue, of course. That's talking about the numerator of the likelihood ratio. And that criticism, of course, is still with us. I think we're trying to confuse two issues here. Whether or not we give likelihood ratios is in a sense, immaterial, but if we were to, we are comparing frequencies under two scenarios. For example, contributors being known or not known. There are two things. I believe if you merely give the bottom line, you are leaving out the alternative. So regardless of how you calculate the bottom line.
Right. But isn't it true, Dr. Weir, that when you were criticizing the National Research Council report in your June 20th report,
Yes.
you were referring to the interpretation of the National Research Council method for mixtures that has been advocated by the defense in this hearing?
I don't think so. My criticisms are whether or not we are comparing frequencies under alternative scenarios.
All right. And yeah, Dr. Weir, could you pick up Exhibit 408, which is your report of June 21st?
Yes, I'm just flicking through pages here. Maybe you could help me to
And
refer me to the page.
If you could direct your attention to page 10, the paragraph labeled mixed stains. And the, yeah, Your Honor, do you have a copy of this?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Now, am I right that the third sentence of that paragraph reads, simply adding the frequencies of all possible contributors to the mixture, Perrin NRC 1992, ignores the essential nature of a mixture?
That's
Now-
what it says, yes.
Right. And now, when you wrote this sentence, you were assuming, were you not, that the NRC approach involved simply adding the frequency of all possible contributors to a mixture, weren't you?
I think that sentence would criticize it if that was the intention. I think, though,
So, but isn't it true? So,
Yes.
I think on reflection I was being unfair to the NRC. I don't believe they would have meant a single contributor. That would have made no sense.
all right. And so the interpretation of the NRC report, which is reflected in the report of June 21st, is not the interpretation that you now would adopt. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, we're getting hung up with words here. The correct interpretation of any evidentiary stain is to compare the frequencies under alternative scenarios. It's simple. in a single stain because the chance of the frequency of the stain under one scenario is just 1, it's 100%. So in essence, the frequency is hidden from us, and then we calculate the frequency for the unknown. And we don't run into any need to examine what we're doing. We can, and we've seen the possibility of sloppy thinking because we've ignored the alternative. For the mixtures, we need to consider both alternatives.
Yeah.
However, one of those alternatives involves multiple unknown contributors, and there's only one possible way for calculating the frequency of multiple contributors, regardless of what the NRC said or meant to say, or is purported to have said. It's not a question of interpretation. Finally, it's a question of how do you calculate the frequency of multiple contributors, and there's only one way to do that.
And you're not relying on the NRC report for the basis for your methods in any case, are
No,
you?
correct.
And you said you were relying on an article published by our friend Ian Evatt,
That's
the English
my,
statistician.
excuse me, that's my published reliance, although I'm relying on my own expertise.
And when was this article by Dr. Evatt and his colleagues published?
1991.
Wasn't it published in 1990?
I thought it was 91. I may be wrong.
My copy says 1990.
Oh, excuse me, then I've misspoken.
Oh, no, I'm reading wrong. You're right. You are right. So 1991. Now, when was the National Research Council report published?
The report was published in 1992, and you've hit on the exact point. Here is a report published by respected people which ignores the literature. It's amazing to me that in this and many other instances, they have chosen to ignore the correct procedures.
Yeah.
Why they didn't cite this paper, I don't know.
Right. And so the very paper on which you were relying was simply ignored by the National Research
The
Council.
paper on which I have cited, I don't rely on that paper.
Now, this paper by Dr. Evatt, the method that it describes is for characterizing mixtures in situations where we know how many contributors there are, is it not?
Yes, I think so. Well, I believe all our calculations assume a number of contributors, yes.
Right. Now, but in this case, we cannot tell by looking at most of the mixtures how many contributors there are, can we?
I think the evidence is overwhelming that there are 2 contributors when we have 7 RFLP loci and 7 PCR loci, and they have at most 4 alleles. I can't imagine any other possible interpretation.
So does this evidence tell you, can you tell just by looking at the genetic evidence the probability that it is 2 persons who contributed versus 3?
I wouldn't attach a probability to that, no.
You could not attach a probability to it, could you?
I'm not sure about that. I could work out the probability of that event conditional on each of those 2 assumptions.
Right. But in order for you to compute the probability of getting these mixtures, assuming that there are either 2 people or 3 people, you'd have to make some assumptions about the a priori probability of there being 2 or 3 contributors, wouldn't you?
No. Well, excuse me, to give a posterior probability of the final analysis. I think the analogy is flawed, however. It ignores what we've been doing throughout the whole trial. For a single stain, we compute the frequency of single contributors because all the evidence suggests there's a single contributor. No one has ever suggested we should compute the evidence of a single stain as though there were multiple contributors. All the evidence suggests there are not multiple contributors. I find the argument somewhat vacuous.
But the answer to the question I just asked you is yes, is it not?
You need to rephrase the question.
The question is, in order for you to compute the probability of getting these mixtures, assuming there are either 2 or 3 people, would you have to make some assumption about the prior probability of there being 2 or 3 people?
So my answer is certainly no to that. Given, if you read it out again, you'll see that's a conditional probability you've just asked me about.
All right. Well, suppose I framed it as a posterior probability. In order to get the posterior probability of there being 2 people versus 3 people, by posterior probability we mean the ultimate issue, are there 2 or 3? We have to make some assumptions about the likelihood there are 2 or 3 there initially, before we look at the genetic evidence, don't we?
We're not making posteriors about any event in this trial. That would be quite inappropriate.
But
That single stains or mixture stains or any other issue before us, we have no priors to put in to end up with posteriors.
okay, and so when you say the evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of there being 2 contributors to a stain,
Yes, there is. There are 7 RFLP loci, each of which has at most 4 alleles. There are 7 PCR loci, well, depending on the stain, each of which has at most 4 alleles. How could it possibly be 3 contributors? It's beyond imagination.
but in order to draw conclusions about the relative likelihood, you have to make some assumptions drawing on other evidence, don't you?
The assumption I choose to do these frequencies is that there are either 2 or 3 contributors. Based on the evidence, there are 2 contributors. I have chosen to do it for 3. I could have done it for 4. I see no point.
What about stain number 29, where we're talking about the stain on the steering wheel? Can you tell by looking at that stain whether there are 2 or 3 contributors?
I can see no evidence there which suggests 3, but you'll give me some time to look at the RFLPs. There aren't there, so we have only the PCRs, and there are 3 alleles at all those loci, at 6 loci, excuse me. 6 loci have 3 alleles. There is nothing there which would suggest 3 contributors.
Let's assume there's no RFLP results on stain number 29.
Well, that's what the chart says.
Right. All right, and we see 3 alleles.
Yes.
All right, and you say, but you can't determine based on those 3 alleles whether there are 2 people or 3 people there, can you?
That is a foolish question in the sense that the evidence
Will you
says there are
answer it,
3
please, sir?
alleles.
Wait. Counsel, he gets to answer the question.
All right.
There are 3 alleles. We know each person has 2. People may share an allele, so 2 people may have 2 alleles, but one of which share, which would end up with 3. I can't imagine why you would invoke 3 people when there are only 3 alleles. There may be 3 people. There may be 6 people. There is nothing there which would require me to assume more than 2.
All right, and so based on the genetic evidence alone, there's no basis for determining whether there's 2 or 3 or 4.
The evidence is that there are only, at most, 4. Here are only 3 alleles. The polymarker had 4, I think. I'd have to look. I think only 3 alleles. So the evidence says there are 3 alleles. That means more than one person. It does not say anything about there being 3 people.
And so you can't tell whether there are 2 versus 3 based on this
I
evidence alone.
can't tell for certainty.
All right, Mr. Thompson, you have to understand, I'm not making this determination in a vacuum. I mean, I assume that we have 2 victims at the crime scene. I'm taking into consideration that there appears to be only one set of footprints. I mean, this is not a determination made in a vacuum. Proceed.
All right. Just one minute. Okay. Now, Dr. Weir, the defense in this case has taken the position that numbers need to be presented to characterize the value of evidence showing consistency between the DNA profile of an individual and a mixed stain. Do you agree that numbers are necessary to show the value of such evidence?
My opinion has changed. I think if you had asked me 2 years ago, I would have agreed. We are now at the point that the numbers are beyond belief. We have got so much genetic evidence. There are so many loci types. Some of these items have 11 RFLP loci. and 7 PCR loci. There is no number that makes any sense. It is beyond the belief, beyond the experience of anyone to try and interpret. I believe we have passed beyond the point where we should run around trying to make up numbers acceptable to everybody. The evidence of a match at this many loci is compelling. So I think once we've got to the point we are presently at, 7 RFLP loci, 7 PCR loci, the numbers are not necessary.
What about for evidence like that on item 29? Would the comments you just made apply to that stain as well?
Well, my comments apply to 7 of each type. On item 29, there are many fewer loci scored. The event of a match is not so astonishing. Then it is indeed helpful to have a number.
All right. And so I believe the intention of the prosecutors initially was to present no numbers in connection with the mixed stains, but merely to present the profile frequencies of individuals who were being compared to the stain. Would you agree with me that that would be a misleading procedure for characterizing the value of stains like number 29, 305, and the other Bronco stains?
Well, that's an omnibus question. I would need to examine each item separately. It would depend on the number of loci.
How about, let's start with number 29 then. Do you think it would be misleading just to present the individual profile of individuals being compared to the stains, such as Nicole Brown Simpson, and not compute a special number that refers to the likelihood of her matching with the mixture?
It's not misleading, no. I mean, the evidence remains that there is a match between the evidence and known samples. That's not misleading to say that.
Well,
it is helpful to interpret that evidence to attach numbers under alternative scenarios.
Mm-hmm. But the question is, would it be misleading to present just Nicole Brown Simpson's individual profile frequency and not do some computation regarding the likelihood of her matching a mixture?
That's not the question you asked me. I don't know why we're computing Nicole Brown's profile frequency. Why are we doing that?
Well, let me ask you the question this way. Would it be misleading to do what the prosecutors were initially advocating in this case, which is to present no number on the mixture per se, but just to present the profile frequencies of individuals who were being compared to the mixture? Would that be misleading, sir?
I don't know how to answer that. I don't understand the question. There is a mixture. You either attach a number to it or you don't. But there is the evidence of a mixture. You either attach a number or not. It's not misleading not to attach a number. It is helpful to attach a number. Calculating one of the matching knowns frequency is beside the point. It's nothing to do with the mixture. So I don't understand.
Well, let's suppose that the frequency of Nicole Brown Simpson's DNA profile on DQ alpha and the polymarker systems ranged from 1 in 2,500 to 1 in 26,000. Do you understand that assumption? That a relatively rare profile across DQ alpha and the polymarker loci.
The frequency of people who would match that profile.
Yes.
That has a range of numbers, certainly.
Right. Now, do you think it would be misleading for prosecutors to give a number like 1 in 26,000 to Nicole Brown Simpson's profile, and then to say, through testimony, that Nicole Brown Simpson's profile is consistent with stain 29 and give no further number?
That doesn't tell all the information. I agree.
So you agree that that would be misleading?
I'm not sure I'd say misleading. It doesn't. It reflects a fallacy of trying to give any of this evidence outside the appropriate framework. Unless you give frequencies attached to items of evidence under alternative scenarios, you cannot make a determination which in fact was the most likely scenario. So any time you try and concoct these methods of presenting evidence outside the appropriate way of doing it, you will run into problems. You or anybody.
Mm-hmm. And by your calculations, the probability that two randomly chosen individuals, one Caucasian and one African American, would match with stain number 29 is 1 in 71. Isn't that right?
That's true.
Right, which is considerably higher than Nicole Brown's profile frequency, isn't it?
Yes.
Right. All right, and so it would be incorrect, wouldn't it, to use Nicole Brown's profile frequency as an index of the value of the fact that she was consistent with that stain, wouldn't it?
If you state it like that, that sounds incorrect to me, yes.
All right. Okay. Now, so it sounds like the real issue here is over methods for doing these mixture calculations, isn't that? And we basically agree a number is needed to characterize a mixture, and our disagreement is how to compute that.
We haven't agreed that a number is needed, no.
Okay. All right. Would you agree, Dr. Weir, that in order to do the kind of calculations that you're doing on the exhibit currently on the ELMO, which I believe is number 410, 409.
409.
Yeah, in order to do the calculations on chart 409, you need to make certain assumptions.
Yes.
And one assumption you need to make is with regard to the number of contributors to the stain.
Yes.
Now, does that assumption with regard to number of contributors, does that assumption have to be made to do the calculations in the manner reflected on chart 410, which is the defense's approach to the calculation?
It doesn't, but that is not a relevant fact. We have no choice. It's not a question of taste or opinion. If we want to estimate the frequency of the contributors to a mixture, we must take account of the number of contributors. I'm not sure how I can say that any more simply. It is not rocket science here.
Now, another assumption that your approach makes is that all alleles of all contributors can be detected. Is that
That's
correct?
true. I've had to assume that. I am not an expert in molecular biology. I take what the forensic scientist reports.
Does that assumption need to be made to do the calculations according to the NRC method as interpreted by the defense chart?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can't start doing anything unless you have a starting point, which is the alleles found. Now, I will continue because there are cases where we know there were 2 contributors, but we see less than 4 alleles at a locus. It shows up more clearly in the RFLP situation, where some of the alleles appear either to be hidden or to be not seen.
Okay, well, let me direct your attention again to chart number, getting confused, is this 409?
This is 410.
410. The defense chart, 410. Now, based on the calculations done on this chart, Dr. Weir, would it be correct to say, among Caucasians, the percentage of people who have genotypes consistent with alleles observed in stain 29 is approximately 45%?
That is a completely misleading statement, and I don't even believe it's true. Consistent means you can account for the stain with the people listed. You cannot account for the stain by adding up those single contributors. The first item does not account for alleles 1.2 and 4. That statement you made, and I listened very carefully, I think comes very close to being dishonest.
Is it incorrect scientifically, Doctor?
It is incorrect scientifically because it is not. I take consistent to mean explaining the data.
All right, let's instead ask the question this way. Would it be correct to say that among Caucasians, the percentage of people who have genotypes that would be included in the stain observed in stain 29, or included in the alleles observed in stain 29 is approximately, let me start again. Based on this chart, number 410, would it be correct to say that among Caucasians, the percentage of people who have genotypes that would be included in the set of alleles observed in stain 29 is approximately 45%.
That statement is correct, but it's misleading in the sense it gives us no basis for interpreting the evidentiary value of this mixed stain. It is a correct statement, but I don't think it has any relevance.
So it's scientifically correct, but it's misleading. Is that your position?
Absolutely.
Now, when you say misleading, what you mean, I take it, is that you think it might give the jurors the wrong idea about how to think about this evidence?
I mean, it's misleading in that it gives us no basis for interpreting the evidence of matching between known contributors and a mixed stain. It gives us just no foundation for drawing any conclusions numerically.
Well, suppose that I, upon learning that Nicole Brown Simpson's genotypes are consistent with those found in stain number 29, was curious to know what percentage of people in the population have genotypes consistent with those in stain 29. Isn't 45% the number that I need to know?
You might want to know that, but that's not a question that we would need to be addressing here. It's not relevant. I mean, that's an interesting question, I suppose, but why would you even ask it? The evidence is that there are two known contributors. They match the mixed stain. How often does that happen? Coincidentally.
All right, so your argument...
If you want to talk about Nicole Simpson, you need to consider the scenario of Nicole Simpson versus another unknown versus two unknowns.
Okay, so if I understand your argument correctly, you are arguing that the way the jury should think about the problem, or the way anyone else should think about the problem, is in terms of the likelihood of getting a pair of individuals that would match rather than just a single individual who would match. Is that your position?
I've been saying that for the last 2 hours.
All right. But, Doctor, isn't that just an argument you're making?
Excuse me, I resent that completely. That is not just an argument. That is the only conceivable way of attaching a frequency to the match of two known contributors in a mixed stain. How could you possibly do anything else? And to characterize it as just an argument, I think, is unfortunate.
Doctor, you keep using this phrase known contributors, as in two known contributors.
Yes, I'm talking about the people not excluded, the people whose profiles we know.
All right, but we don't know who the contributors are of any stains in this case based on the genetic evidence
the
alone,
known
do we?
samples, yes.
All right, so those are assumptions. All right.
Well, that's what we have to do, what the jury eventually will have to decide. Are these two known people the contributors, or are two other people? So we are comparing those two known people with two unknown people. So that's not an assumption. That's what the trial is about, to make decisions on the origins of these stains.
All right. To answer questions about the number of people in the population or in some population that would have genotypes that would be included in a mixture, such as number 29, is it necessary to make assumptions about whether all alleles of all contributors to the mixture have been observed?
Thought we asked that question.
All right.
You have asked, I have answered, and on the RFLPs we don't. My calculations show that we allow for unseen bands.
Well, what about, let me restate the question, and I believe it's a different question this time, Your Honor. If the question that I want to have answered is what percentage of the population would have genotypes consistent with the observed alleles, isn't it true that I don't have to make any assumptions at all about whether all alleles of all contributors have been observed?
I think I understand the question. The answer is yes, and that's what I've done. My calculations assume these are the only alleles in the mixed stain.
All right. So
for the PCR.
But to do it the way reflected on the defense chart, where you're simply summing and asking the question what percentage of the population has genotypes consistent with the observed alleles, we need make no assumption about whether all alleles have been observed. Isn't that correct?
You don't need to make any assumptions, but then you don't end up with a meaningful answer.
Right. Whereas under your approach, assumptions do need to be made about whether or not all alleles of all contributors have been observed.
That is correct for the mixture and the single stains. It's at the foundation of the whole forensic uses of DNA. We have alleles seen, we calculate frequencies for them. If one was to object to that assumption, one may as well hang up their hat and go home, because none of this would be possible. Of course we assume the number of contributors is consistent with the evidence,
Okay.
either one or two or however many.
And so there are two assumptions that are being made under your approach which need not be made
I object to you characterizing it as my approach.
under the approach that you have presented in your report.
Thank you.
There are two assumptions being made there that need not be made to use the kind of numbers that are presented in the defense chart. One being the number of contributors and the other being the connection between the observed alleles and the contributors' alleles.
For both mixed and single stains, yes.
Yes, okay. Now, Doctor, your expertise is in drawing statistical inferences from genetic data.
Yes.
Is that correct? And one of the issues that statisticians like yourself are most concerned with is what is and isn't a logical inference from a scientific finding.
Yes.
And I often hear statisticians use the term permissible, as in this is a permissible.
Excuse me, I didn't hear the word.
Permissible.
Oh, excuse me.
As in this is a permissible inference or this is not a permissible inference. Is that a common expression in your field?
It's not one I've heard before, no.
Okay. Well, what expression would you use to talk about an inference which is illogical and inappropriate?
I call it wrong, I suppose.
Wrong. Okay. And I gather when statisticians say an inference is wrong, it means it's illogical or fails to follow from the premises.
I imagine they would, yes.
Okay. And the question about which inferences are correct and incorrect, wrong or right, when interpreting scientific data is one of the major questions that statisticians concern themselves with.
I don't see statistics as being concerned with giving right or wrong answers. Statistics is concerned with teasing out the information in sets of data. Our results are often phrased in terms of estimates or results of hypothesis testing. Statistics is not a black and white, right or wrong, yes or no kind of a science. It's a science of interpreting data. So I'm having trouble with understanding your characterization of statistics.
But part of what statisticians do is determine what is and what is not a reasonable statistical inference from data. Isn't that correct?
Counsel, the issue is, which of these two methodologies am I going to adopt for use in front of this jury? Which makes sense, both in terms of the science that produces these results and the math that's applied to it?
Yeah.
So,
These questions are foundational to my next line.
well,
I'll proceed quickly. Dr. Weir, when drawing conclusions from a scientific test, should an expert witness in a criminal case rely only on the scientific data, or is it permissible for the expert to take into account other evidence in the case?
This is such a general question, I don't understand it. I'll say yes, but I'm not fully understanding what you're meaning.
Well, suppose, for example, that an expert sees a scientific test result